Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviors within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction through the lens of the deceptive sexuality trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. In today's episode, I want to cover a topic that follows on a little bit from the last episode, and that topic is full therapeutic disclosure. Now, many people listening to this will probably be familiar with the idea of full disclosure, but I'm sure it will also be new to some of you. As a brief introduction, when we're thinking about deceptive sexuality treatment or perhaps sex addiction or compulsive sexual behavior treatment, and when it's occurring within the context of a relationship, we know that a significant part of the treatment should be taking into account the impact on the partner, what we tend to refer to as betrayal trauma. And when discovery occurs, the partner's reality, as we've talked about a lot on this podcast, is often shattered. And we know that one of the most destabilizing things for that partner is this feeling of not having access to the full reality or the full truth of what happened. And even if they do happen to have all of that information, if it has all been disclosed to them, there's generally no way of knowing that with any degree of confidence. And it makes sense that if someone finds out that they've been lied to persistently, or had something hidden from them for a long, long time, it then becomes very hard to really trust that they have the full truth. And as I've mentioned in previous episodes, we also know that one of the common responses to the discovery of the secret sexual basement from the person that was maintaining that basement is what we might call trickled truths or staggered disclosures. The person who's been discovered giving away the bare minimum of information and keeping as much hidden as possible as a form of self-protection. And then there will tend to gradually be more and more disclosures, more and more discoveries that occur, information gradually trickling out. And this becomes another additional painful part of the journey for both people, but especially for the betrayed partner. So for somebody who's experienced this kind of trauma, knowing the full truth, knowing the full reality becomes a critical foundation of any kind of healing process, both as an individual, but also potentially for healing within the coupleship. Because how can a couple ever move forward if they're living in different realities, or if the betrayed partner doesn't know if they have access to the actual reality of what happened or not? In that situation, there's so often a sense of just waiting for the next discovery or waiting for the next bomb to be dropped. And as you can imagine, that's an exhausting and destabilizing situation to be living in. And so full therapeutic disclosure is one of the clinical tasks we can undertake to try and facilitate this process of bringing both partners into the same reality. And essentially how that works is the person that maintained the secret sexual basement creates what's called a full disclosure document, which will cover the full story of the acting out, exactly what happened, what types of behaviors were engaged in, perhaps how frequently those behaviors happened, how they escalated, and so on. It's a full disclosure of all of the acting out that occurred beyond the implicit or explicit agreements of the intimate relationship. And this would be done, certainly if we're talking about full therapeutic disclosure, as I'm discussing here, under the guidance of a therapist or perhaps a coach who has the specific training necessary to take a client through this kind of task. In fact, this will generally involve professional support for both partners involved in the process. So perhaps a therapist to guide the person that maintained the basement through the creation of the disclosure document itself, and then perhaps a therapist to guide the betrayed partner through the preparation for the disclosure process, which includes things like formulating specific questions they might want to be answered, and perhaps determining the level of information and detail that they want covered within the document. And once all of that preparation is carefully done, there will then generally be a full disclosure reading with both partners and both therapists present to guide the process and make sure that it's done as safely as possible. The person that created the disclosure document will read it out to their partner within that therapeutic setting. So there's this transfer of information happening with the goal of bringing both people into the same reality, both people having access to the full story and therefore being able to make a fully informed decision moving forward. And when doing full therapeutic disclosure, this will often then be followed by a polygraph test of some form. So again, the person who created and read the disclosure document potentially undertaking a polygraph to provide some veracity or proof that the disclosure document was indeed a full disclosure. So that's a very brief overview of what a full therapeutic disclosure is. Again, the person who has acted out within the relationship with the help of therapeutic support creates a full, detailed version or story of the acting out. Then within a therapeutic setting, reads that disclosure to the betrayed partner. And there's that transfer of information. Both people are now on the same page. I would add that there's a lot of nuance involved on a case-by-case basis. Again, the level of detail that's required, what setting it's going to be done in, what's the time frame for doing the disclosure, what are we going to do after the disclosure reading, all of these different things. But as you can imagine, the number one thing to keep in mind is that this has the potential to be a further traumatic event, a painful event, especially if it isn't handled well. It can be a just and right thing to do, and it can ultimately be a real foundation for healing, especially for the partner to now know their reality, as painful as that is to know. But it's just critical that this is done as safely as possible with skilled, knowledgeable therapeutic support and with the safety of the people involved at the forefront of the process. Now, for many people listening to this, nothing I've said so far will be new. You might have already done a full disclosure, you might be in the process of doing one, or you might have plans to do one. But what I really want to talk about today, rather than go into too much depth on the process itself, is to look at the bigger picture of why we might consider full disclosure as a really important part of the process through this lens of the DST model. And so this is where it really follows on from what I spoke about last time with restorative justice and power imbalances. So if we were to start by considering potential pushbacks against the idea of doing a full disclosure. So you might hear things like maybe it's too shaming or perhaps dehumanizing for the person that has acted out, or that we're treating them like a criminal somehow. Maybe that it's re-traumatizing for the partner, or it's introducing additional trauma where it's unnecessary. These are the kinds of things that people who don't agree with the idea of full therapeutic disclosure might put forward. And as I said in last week's episode, it's really important when we consider these pushbacks to not just take something like full therapeutic disclosure as a given. We should have good reasons for wanting to do it. And part of that is exploring what are the bigger picture arguments for doing a disclosure. So yes, on a very simple level, a full therapeutic disclosure is simply about the partner needing to know the reality of what occurred, and they currently don't know that reality. It is a transfer of information. But we can also zoom out a bit and consider this through that lens of restorative justice. That's why this is really important. I have argued through the lens of this DST model that the secret sexual basement is more than just an acting out problem. It is a system that results in a power imbalance and covert control. The person who has maintained the secret sexual basement has access to potentially life-altering information that the partner does not have access to because it is being intentionally withheld from them. So there is a power imbalance in the relationship. There is covert control occurring. And if you remember, I mentioned that one of the key ethical concerns, therefore, when we are moving forward with treatment in this model, is to address that power imbalance. So the transfer of information that is occurring when we do a full disclosure is not just about the partner knowing the truth of what happened, although that is critical. It is actually in part about taking that power imbalance away, or at least taking a significant step to reducing that power imbalance. We are taking an intentional step towards equality when a full therapeutic disclosure is completed. And if we think again about this concept of restorative justice versus retributive justice, you might remember some of those key questions of restorative justice that I mentioned. When we've identified a source of injustice or harm that's occurred. Firstly, honoring the victim of the harm and asking them, how were you harmed? And what do you need in order to heal or in order for justice to occur? Well, we would argue that for the majority of partners, they could answer those questions along the lines of, how were you harmed? By having my reality or the reality of what was occurring hidden from me, by having information hidden from me. What do you need in order to heal or in order for justice to occur? I need access to that information. I need to be living in the same reality as my partner so I can make a fully informed decision. We then considered questions like, who caused the harm? Who carries the obligation for justice or restoration? Or who carries the obligation for meeting the needs of the person who has been harmed? In this case, that would be the person who's caused the harm, the person who has maintained the secret reality and hidden the truth of what was occurring. And so fundamentally, we're saying the hiding of a secret sexual reality from the intimate partner is unjust. It causes significant undeserved harm. And the person that hid that reality, therefore, has an obligation to try and meet the needs of the person who has been harmed by it, which goes beyond just stopping the behaviors that were happening within the basement, the acting out behaviors themselves, but also requires a willingness to open the basement up, to turn the lights on, and that's what we're really doing with full disclosure. So it is not about dehumanizing or punishing the person doing the disclosure. It is not a retributive justice tool. It is a restorative justice tool. It is helping people move towards justice, starting with access to reality, access to information. And then that's also why the focus on stopping the integrity abuse, stopping the deception, the ongoing lies and minimizations becomes such a critical part of this work as well. These are all significant steps towards restorative justice. Now, I know I haven't gone into a huge amount of depth there on the process itself, but I hope that that's helpful in terms of understanding why full therapeutic disclosure might be an important part of the treatment process for many people. And I would just now want to add a couple more brief thoughts that might be helpful as well for anyone who is considering full disclosure or for whom this sounds like it might be something to consider in the future. Firstly, remember that it is ultimately up to you. This is a process done by willing participants. It is not something that should be pushed upon you by anyone, whether that's your treatment team or anyone else. It is very much something that is done by willing participants to move towards relational restorative justice. And secondly, within that, we should be advocating for and valuing all of the people involved in the process. But particularly as we're identifying harm and identifying the secret sexual basement as an abusive system, we should be strongly advocating for the betrayed partner in these cases. And the process should be made as empowering and safe as possible for that partner. And so I would say that when we are planning a disclosure, when the partner is working with perhaps a therapist and considering the questions they specifically want to ask or the level of detail that they want to be included, my view is that ultimately the betrayed partner has the right to have access to that information. So part of me very much feels like, who am I to suggest what level of detail a person should or shouldn't have access to about their own reality? However, I would just want to add, from a sense of personal responsibility, that this is something that needs a huge amount of careful consideration. It is easy to just assume, I want all of the information, I want every detail. But it's important to explore what the potential ramifications of that are, because there is a risk of introducing new triggers, new pain points that you might regret further down the line if you haven't carefully thought it through beforehand with your disclosure guide or with your treatment team. For example, would I want to know where certain things happened? If I do, am I willing to accept that those places, maybe hotels, maybe certain parts of the area that I live in, might now be extremely triggering? They might become places I can no longer go without a deep sense of discomfort. Do I want to know details about potential acting out partners? Or maybe particular search terms that were used? What are the potential negative consequences of knowing that information? Might I now face triggers when I see a person with a certain hair color, for example? So I think it's important to put that out there as something to take into account. I don't think a betrayed partner should ever feel like they are having information withheld from them. I think it is their right, and I think we should advocate for that. However, I think we also need to always skillfully consider potential consequences, because the last thing we want to do is to create additional harm further down the line in any way. So that would be something to talk with your treatment professional about, to really consider what is the best way forward for you, in your situation, in your coupleship, that is going to give you the strongest foundation possible to heal from, both individually in the first place, but also potentially as a couple. And then one final point I would say, building on top of that, is please don't think of disclosure itself as necessarily being a source of healing. I prefer to think of disclosure as part of building a foundation upon which healing can occur. So building a more solid foundation. So disclosure itself can set us back. It can be an extremely painful process. It can feel like we're back to square one, or even further back, because maybe there's new information now that I need to reconcile. But if we can look at it as a potential foundation upon which we can now build, and as a tool of restorative justice, as I've described here, I think that changes the perspective and changes the expectation of disclosure and what it is and what it's for. And so I hope it's helpful to think about it in this way. And I hope the things I've spoken about today give some clarity, but I would just stress that everyone's going to have different ways of doing disclosure within reason. And so make sure if you're looking to do a disclosure with someone, your needs are aligned with how they are willing to do it, and that they are someone that's going to advocate for you and advocate for this being as safe a process as possible. Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the deceptive sexuality trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.